Chapter 9. Trial and Punishment. So it was that war began between the people of Abaka, the giants of the mountain, and the kingdom of Kali. The Council of Councils resolved that Shamari would act as the great Nakamba, the war leader of all the mountain people. He would be their king of kings. They knew that only with his great strength and wisdom could they hope to prevail against the armies of Kali, the Zembai, and the people of the snake united. Each day the king rose from the marriage bed and armored himself. Each day he went into battle and led the charge. Each night he returned to Halima, bloody sometimes, wounded sometimes, but always he returned. Once 3 days passed in which the mountain sky burned with lightning. It rained and thundered furiously, and ravens cried out omens of death. Still he returned to take his young bride in his arms. He quieted her tears with smiling words. "Do you think anything would stop me from returning to such beauty? Each day in battle I am surrounded by death. I see your face, I hear your voice, I smell your flesh, and a lust for life seizes me and gives me strength. I will always come for you, Halima. Even from death I will come for you." Every night when he returned, he made fierce love to her, as if for the last time. Halima reminded him of his duties to his other wives, especially the first, but he was deaf to her words. If this night might be his last on earth, he would spend it with his true heart, Halima. A few months into the war, Halima was in the compound's grinding house, singing a song of loneliness. She sat with the other wives and serving women, grinding millet. With all the men gone, there was always work to be done. The women now had to tend the men's fields as well as their own. Now that she was married, Halima had been given her own field by the king on which to raise yams, banana trees, and oil palm. The properties were hers until death, and would someday be inherited by her sons. Because she had no sons of her own yet to help her tend the field, however, some of the other wives lent their boys to help those who were too young to go into battle, such as Kikoi, whom she had saved from the river. She and the other women were laboring side by side when a horn blew, announcing the return of the warriors. Halima ran out with all the women and looked out over the wall of the compound. She saw the men crossing the bridge, a now familiar sight, but this time they were singing in low, somber voices, with their heads bowed. Overhead they carried a white flag, the color of death. Royal blood had been spilled. With all the wives of Shamari, Halima bounded toward the city gates. Some of them were beginning to wail already and pull out their hair. As they reached the city gates, they could see the grim, stony faces of the approaching warriors. The young swift warriors who had galloped off with such an eager gait now shuffled, heads bowed and many weeping like girls. Halima dropped to her knees. "No, my king, my lover, my husband cannot be dead," she cried. She saw a corpse being carried, dripping blood, with his strong, familiar features. She stood up, feeling faint, and stumbled toward it. She saw that it was Shamari, brow furrowed, pain etched in his face, who carried Hassani, the brave tree harvester, in his arms. He held the boy tenderly, as one might carry an infant. The youth's perfect, sculpted body was marred only by a small crimson badge at his heart, where a spear had pierced it. Shamari's eyes were full of tears as he trudged along blindly, listing to one side as if he were barely able to carry the load. He looked like an old, old man. When he saw Halima, he stopped and met her eyes. Helplessly, he stood there swaying and whispered hoarsely, "He was all that was best in me." Halima started to comfort her husband when from behind her she heard a high-pitched squawk, like the scream of an eagle struck by an arrow in mid-flight. Rashida, mother to Hassani, elbowed through the crowd and flung herself into the dust. Shamari knelt down to rest the body of the slain Hassani on the ground before her. Don't you let him touch the ground, as Rashida hissed angrily. Shamari knelt, his son's corpse still in his arms. Halima knelt beside him and placed her hand on his shoulder. His head drooped on her hand. Halima could feel his tears dripping on her fingers. Rashida exclaimed, "Old man, you take your son to be butchered, and then pleasure yourself with your outlander concubine, who you stole from him." Shamari reached for her to quiet her rage. Rashida snapped, "Let your Kalian whore comfort you." Shamari sighed and gently rested the remains of Hassani on the ground before him. He stood up, shaking off his grief like dust, and pulled himself erect. He commanded Rashida, "Woman, see that the body of my son is bathed and prepared for burial." He turned to the crowd of gaping onlookers and roared so that all could hear, "My people, grieve for 3 days, then we return to battle." After the death of Hassani, Shamari fell into a deep melancholy. Only the sweet songs of Halima could bring a smile to his face. When not battling the enemy, he refused to be anywhere but at her side. One day, as Shamari lay resting in her house, and Halima sat beside him, singing gently, the head of the Council of Elders visited. Watande was a stooped old man with a beard the color of cotton. Shamari bid him to sit down, and Halima rushed to bring him some food and drink. After exchanging greetings and eating some millet cakes Halima had brought him, Watende told the king the reason for his visit. Halima listened quietly, as she had been taught a wife must when her husband discusses matter of importance with an elder. "Shamari, a case has been brought against you in the council," Watende said. "By whom, Venerable Watande?" "By your first wife, Rashida." "What?" "She says you have neglected her, that you have brought gifts as spoils of war only for your youngest and least wife, Halima, and none for them, and that you have refused them your company at night." Shamari gave a sharp laugh. "Venerable friend of my father, we are in the thick of war. Does the council have time for this womanish nonsense?" "It is her right by law, Great Lion. There has been talk in the council as well." "About what, old man?" Shamari laughed bitterly. "Which of his wives the king chooses to sleep with?" "There are those in the council who say it is not fitting our king should make love to the daughter of the king of Kali, while Kalians and their allies murder our sons." Shamari's voice became angry. "Did you not welcome this woman into our kingdom with your own hands? Or is your memory failing you so much that you forget?" "It is not I who say these things, son of Simba, but others say the king acts like a lovesick boy, thinking of nothing but this woman while our kingdom faces destruction. There are those who say we will lose this war." Shamari leapt to his feet, looming over the old man. With a bitter rage Halima had never seen in him before, he growled, "Yes, we will lose this war, I swear it. If our elders spend their hours gossiping like old hags at the marketplace, instead of telling us how to defeat the enemy, we will be destroyed, like every kingdom, from within." He clutched the old man by the shoulders in a grip so savage it looked to Halima as if he were going to break him in half. He glowered into Watende's eyes. Then he embraced the old man. "By the name of the Great One, they call us giants, but we are truly small and pitiable as ordinary men." The trial took place in the great hall, which was packed with curious spectators until it reeked of sweat. Rashida's kin, all long-boned and stern folk, sat on one side of the room, ready to give support to her cause. The strong-jawed kin of Shamari sat on the other, glaring at their in-laws icily. Between the two camps were crowded most of the adults in the city. The Council of Elders sat on stools in a semicircle, with Shamari and Rashida seated facing them. Halima sat behind the king and queen, along with the other of Shamari's wives. To her dismay, she had learned she would not be allowed to say anything at the proceedings. She would have to remain in frustrated silence while Shamari and Rashida waged verbal warfare. Watande, as chief elder, first called upon Rashida to speak. Rashida stood up. She was attired regally in her finest silk dress, and she paced as she spoke confidently. Venerable Watande, respected members of the council, forgive me. I know that our country is at war, and you can little spare time to hear the troubles of one woman and her family. But there is a proverb, the ruin of the nation begins in the homes of the people. It is our families, it is our traditions we are warring to protect. We are only our laws. Without them, we are nothing. We are as air. And our traditions say a husband is to love and protect each of his wives, holding none in higher regard than the other, save only his first wife, whom he must hold above the others, that she may guide the others and be a mother to all his family. An enthusiastic relative from the back interjected, Yes, speak the truth, sister. Halima had to admit that Rashida was riveting to watch as she paced back and forth, tigress-like. Now her voice became more strident. But the king, Shamari, who should set an example to all, has given his least and youngest wife a place of special favor. He brings her back gifts, booty from the enemy, such as this, which was found in her house. Triumphantly, she held up the sea turtle medallion, which Shamari had given Halima. As she displayed the symbol of the enemy for the crowd to see, there was a collective gasp from the people. The point made, she tossed the pendant contemptuously into Halima's lap. Rashida went on, In this time of crisis, he has not sought our counsel, nor our succor, nor has he comforted us in our fears. And in these 3 months of war, he has not lain with me as a husband, nor with any of his wives, except the Kalian, Halima. At that there was an explosive outburst of mumbling from the spectators, which Watande quickly silenced. The queen went on, I cannot say if my husband has committed these things willfully, or if the outsider has used witchcraft, to bend him to her, but I've been wronged. That is my complaint. Having spoken, Rashida sat down. Halima's heart began to pound as the crowd turned and looked at her fearfully. That is why we are failing in this battle, when arms have never failed us before, she heard a spectator whisper. The king of Kali has his daughter working witchcraft. Another agreed. Who knows the secret meaning of the muttering she makes in her alien tongue? She may be cursing our sons to die. Watande hushed the wagging tongues and soberly called on Shamari. Shamari, king of the Abaka, what say you in your defense? Shamari rose slowly. He was silent for a moment. Then the words, spoken in his rich, mellifluous voice, came pouring out. It is true that I love Halima. I love all my wives, as a husband should. Halima I love in a different way, a way that is new to me. As he spoke, his deep black eyes met Halima's, and he smiled. There is something in her, a wisdom, a goodness, a childish innocence, and a freshness of spirit that gives me courage and hope. Without her, I could not live or rule. He turned sternly to Rashida. Queen Rashida asks you to protect our traditions, but she herself attacks tradition. She attacks tradition when she calls Halima Kalian and would make you hate her for it. Yet all you know that through the ancient rites of our grandfathers, Halima has become one of us, an Abaka. And again she attacks tradition when she shows jealousy for her co-wife, whom she should love as a daughter. If breaking traditions is a crime, then it is she who is guilty. The people mumbled again after hearing Shamari's eloquent words, some in agreement, others unmoved. Watande bade Shamari and his wives leave, along with the spectators, while the council of elders pondered its decision. Outside, Shamari, Halima, and Rashida stood in a triangle, with the other wives in an awkward huddle nearby. They stood silently under the intense flooding light of the noonday sun. Finally, Shamari broke the silence. He stepped forward and clutched Rashida's shoulders. Rashida, we have aired our naked feelings before the people. Can we end this shameful spectacle now and go home? When Rashida spoke, her voice trembled with emotion. If once, only once, you looked at me the way you look at her, she said. She stared into the king's eyes beseechingly. Shamari returned her gaze helplessly and whispered, Rashida, I'm sorry. I cannot. The eyes of the queen narrowed and the features became cold as ice. She turned her back on them, and holding her shoulders with stiff dignity, she marched back toward the hall. A moment later, they were all called back in. Watande rose and spoke for all the council. Shamari, who men call Lion, King of Kings of all the Abaka, son of Simba the Strong, we cannot say our love for young Halima is wrong. There are many tales from our people about this kind of love. Love stronger than the normal love a man has for his wife or even his own mother. Yes, and in an ordinary man and in an ordinary time, this type of love is no evil. But in a king, in a time of crisis, such an all-consuming passion is a dangerous thing. The people surrender themselves to your rule because they trust your wisdom and the lucid vision of your third eye. If we let you rule by impulse and hot blood, forgetting law and tradition, you become not a king but a tyrant. Shamari, the council rules against you. You have wronged your first wife. There were murmurs of approval from the packed hall, especially from Rashida's kinfolk. The old man turned to Rashida. Now, the question arises, what is to be done? This council can order many things, but it cannot order your husband to love you, Rashida. He quoted a proverb. To love someone who does not love you is like shaking a leaf to make the dewdrops fall. Rashida bowed her head. So, the council puts it in your hands, Rashida. You decide what is to be done. Again the crowd murmured in general agreement with the Solomon-like decision. The elders of the council exchanged glances of self-congratulation. But Halima felt only bitterness. This way the elders managed to restore harmony to the community while ducking all responsibility for what became of her, and putting the entire burden on Rashida. She knew without a doubt, as they did, that the first wife would demand banishment. Then Rashida stood up, her whole body trembling. Say again that the decision is mine, Rashida demanded. Indeed, the choice is yours, replied Watende. Rashida flung out her hand, pointing at Halima. Then I choose that with his own hands King Shamari cut out the heart of Halima, and that he is to throw her body over the great falls. Halima almost fell out of her seat. Instantly there was complete pandemonium in the great hall, as people traded astonished reactions with their neighbors. She overheard snatches of arguments and commentary. Yes, when a vine encircles your house, it's time to cut it down, one old crone said to another. The elders looked at each other in dismay. Shamari was on his feet, objecting. Watende, by the spirit of my father, who called you friend, stop this, he roared above the crowd. Again Watende silenced the crowd. He called to the queen. Rashida, daughter of the Abaka, I have known you since you were a child. You are not so cruel as to command the murder of an innocent. I know you are not. I ask you, as High Elder of the Council, to think again what you have said, and ask whether it will truly bring you joy. You have promised me what you have promised me, Rashida intoned stubbornly. The old man sighed. Shamari cried, This is madness! Watende turned to Shamari. Sternly he told him, Shamari, we of the council have ruled in favor of your first wife. Even a king must obey the law,
and you have heard what the law demands. Before the sun rises tomorrow, you must do as Rashida said, or you are our king no longer."
Watande turned back to Rashida, who sat stiffly, facing forward, flushed with emotion. He shook his head and said,
"I pity you."
Shamari and Halima were in the sacred grove where his ancestors were buried, looking out over the majestic mountainside. Overhead, thick gray clouds, pregnant with rain, crawled. Shamari stood brooding, while Halima knelt beside him quietly.
"Without me as their king, our people would be crushed like grass beneath an elephant's heel. I cannot step down. Reason and law are both against you. All that weighs for you is my love."
"I trust you to do what is right, husband," she replied. Shamari lifted her to her feet and looked her in the eyes.
"Your soft words cut me like a knife," he said.
Halima pushed away. Angrily, nostrils twitching, she told him, "I am a princess of Kali, Shamari. I will not beg for mercy, and you are my husband, sworn to protect me forever. I will not plead with you to spare my life." Shamari winced at her flash of anger. She realized she had never been angry with him before. He bowed his head in thought for a moment. Then he looked up and pointed to the mountain peak.
"I will go to the mountain top and speak to our great seer, Oloshigan. I shall return before nightfall."
He bent and kissed her on the cheek tenderly. He turned and went off. No ordinary man today could scale that terrible mountain face of ancient, jagged, crumbling stone, but Shamari, whose limbs were strong as iron, crept up the nooks and crevices of the mountain as easily as Anansi the spider might race up a wall. Halima waited in her little house, feeling awfully helpless. "I could run away," she thought, "and return to my people. But even if I escape, how would I make it through the forest? And could I truly bear to live without Shamari? No, better to stay and face him, for if he truly loves me, he cannot harm me." The storm clouds broke, and heavy raindrops began to pound on the roof of Halima's house. Forked lightning announced Shamari's return. His garments were drenched. Water poured down his face. Halima helped him off with his soaking clothes, and they sat together on her bed. She saw that his face was drawn and weary. He told her,
"I sat with the great seer, Oloshigan, he who sees into the far reaches of the past and the future. I sat with him by the fire in his cave, and he spoke these words. He said, 'This woman from the sea loves you more than life or truth or family or honor. If she lives, the day will come when, for love of you, she will betray the Abaka and bring destruction upon your people. If she lives, the Abaka will die. If she dies, the Abaka will live.'"
Halima saw that her husband's eyes were full of tears. He embraced her. That night, Shamari and Halima made violent, furious love. They never slept, but all through the night were locked in a sweaty and animal embrace, clawing each other. His manhood never lost its steel, penetrating again and again, rummaging inside her. She howled, thrashing under him as wave after wave of drowning passion swept over her. He burrowed deep down inside her and filled her with all that was in him, crying out her name, weeping. At dawn, Shamari and Halima left her house. The morning birds were just beginning to sing, and a soft orange light conferred a gentle radiance on the city. Halima decided she had never seen a more beautiful day. She walked along in the white, pleated dress she had worn at her wedding. She felt strangely serene, although she knew she was being taken into the woods to die. Shamari marched 3 paces ahead of her, carrying a long, deadly spear over his shoulder. Its jagged iron tip was nicked from battle, sticking up like the leering head of a viper. Halima realized that her serenity came from her deep feeling that Shamari could not hurt her. In the belly of her soul, she did not believe he would harm her. When they were deep into the forest, in a little clearing, Shamari turned to her. His face was as gray as a dead man's.
"Turn from me, wife, and kneel," he ordered gently.
Halima did as she was told, slowly kneeling in the soft, dewy grass.
"Wife, give me your gown."
Halima obeyed her husband. Unfastening her robe and passing it to Shamari, she knelt on the jungle floor in her loincloth, shielding her bosom. The morning air chilled her naked skin, and she began to tremble. She threw back her head and looked up through the trees to the sunshine penetrating the leaves. Halima thought about how much she loved life. She saw herself playing with her brothers and sisters in the bright, shallow waters of Kali. She remembered Nima, her friend. The first time she met Shamari's eyes, her eyes began to water. He could not, she reminded herself. He could not, he would not harm her. She would believe that, no matter what, even if it was to be her dying thought. "I know you will not harm me," she said defiantly, proudly holding up her head as tears began to roll down her cheeks. He stood behind her grimly now, casting a giant shadow on the forest floor. Halima bowed her head. She saw his shadow bring up the spear above his head for one swift thrust. Shamari's voice was choked with pain.
"Great One in the sky, spirits of these mountains, forgive me."
Halima saw the shadow of the spear hurtling down and closed her eyes. An hour later, Shamari went to the house of his first wife. She was waiting on her bed, looking more beautiful than ever, with her long black braids painstakingly twisted by her servants. She looked at him diffidently. Without saying a word, the king flung at her the blood-stained wedding dress of Halima, turned, and stalked out of the room with absolute finality. At the same time, Halima ran through the woods, the cooling dew of the rainforest cleansing her naked skin. She cast her mind back to the events of that morning. When Halima had opened her eyes, still in this world, she heaved a sigh of relief. Then, hearing a grunt of pain behind her, she whirled to see Shamari standing, holding his thigh in pain. He had sliced open a gash in his own flesh with his spear. Now he quickly wrapped her gown around the wound, allowing the blood to soak freely into it, turning it bright red. Halima gasped and reached to help, but he held her back. He grinned weakly. Halima stood up and faced him.
"I could not, Halima. No, even though duty and the will of the Great One demanded it."
Halima smiled. "No complaints here, my lord." At that moment there was a noise in the bush. Halima turned in alarm and saw emerge Kokoye, the king's son, whom she had saved from drowning. The boy, who carried a satchel and a bow and quiver, stood panting. He stuck out his skinny bare chest proudly and said, "No one saw me come, father." Shamari limped forward and took Halima by the shoulders and put her cousin's sea turtle pendant about her neck.
"Beautiful Halima, I am returning you to the land of your father. I cannot protect you here. Kokoye will guide you."
Halima grabbed his broad hands. "Come with me, husband." He shook his head.
"My place is here, defending the kingdom."
Halima looked at him earnestly. "Then—"
"You must forget these mountains, Halima, and all your life here."
Halima turned away bitterly. "And will you forget me, Shamari, king of the Abaka?" He stood behind her and gripped her tightly.
"I will forget you the day I breathe my last," he whispered.
He tore himself away from her and turned his attention to his son, who had grown a trifle in the past few months and was about as tall as Halima.
"Kokoye, never forget the river. This woman saved your life, and now you must guard hers, even with your own."
The boy, who, Halima knew up till then had never had a duty more important than tending his father's goats, nodded solemnly. Shamari said,
"This is a man's job. I know, Kokoi, but you alone can I trust in this. Sometimes, in times of war, a boy must fast become a man. Travel quickly through the thickest forests of the mountain and avoid any people you see. Take Halima to the winding river. The caravan of the famed merchant Kembu will pass there in 3 days, and with them she can travel safely to Kali."
He handed the boy his spear. The youngster took it as if it were magical.
"This is the spear of your grandfather, Simba, the great warrior king. Do not dishonor it."
"Yes, father," the boy replied. The king bent down and kissed him.
"Be careful, beloved son."
Shamari turned to Halima. Their eyes met, both full of emotion. He took her in his arms. Halima, fighting tears, whispered, "I will never love another, Shamari." Hoarsely he said in her ear,
"Someday I swear I will come for you."
He pressed his lips against hers. Now Halima and Kokoi, both in loincloths, ran through the rainforest on the start of their journey. Lithe and quick, the boy moved through the woods like a small forest goat. But he would never get too far before looking back in concern and waiting for Halima to catch up. "Hurry, little mother, hurry," he would shout. "We must run faster." Halima followed him, but first she paused to look over her shoulder at the silver-peaked mountain. With defiance she declared, "I will return to this place." So it was that Halima, wife of Shamari, king of all the Abaka, was banished from his kingdom and set forth on a journey back to her homeland, Kali. She knew not that on the throne now sat a usurper, King Aligbadi, who had at his disposal the great wealth of Kali, the ferocious might of the Zimbai, and the endless cunning of the people of the snake.